Therapists of Reddit, what has been your I know I'm not supposed to judge, but holy crap moment? So, I once had a man who was attending family therapy with his 3 children admit that his last child, a girl, was an accident we tried to abort. We only wanted boys. The sad thing is, though, the girl didn't even look bothered. She had clearly heard it all before. They were attending family therapy as the girl was actively wanting to self-unalive, and they, quote, didn't know why. Next story. I worked with a teenager who was struggling with eating disorders, to the point where she'd been hospitalized for organ damage at one point a few months before. I went to dinner with the girl and her mother. Her mom spent the entire dinner counting the individual pieces of rice the mom, was eating so she could accurately count the calories she consumed. I asked the mom to stop and she just stared at me and asked why she would do that because she had to watch her figure. I wonder where the 15-year-old got her eating disorder from. Edit. For those of you wondering why I was eating with the kid and the mom, the teen was inpatient and the mom was visiting. I was working as a psych tech at the time and the kid wasn't allowed to eat unsupervised since I had to document her food intake to make sure she was eating sufficiently as a part of her treatment plan. So I joined her and her mom in the cafeteria for the meal. I definitely passed along the info about the mom's eating habits for the therapist to follow up with in family therapy. Okay, so I've got to throw in my opinion here. Counting each grain of rice is comically stupid. I don't even think the character Monk from the TV show called Monk would do that. That is so dumb. Anyway, also I'm back on Undersparked. What's up, y'all? I'm not the new narrator. I'm the old narrator. Anyway, next story. I heard concerning information about the way a child was being treated. Not my patient, but a sibling of the patient that I had never met. Called CPS and reported it that day. And the following day, found out the child had died. It was traumatizing, and 6 years later, I still think about it a lot. Next story. A lovely teen girl was brought to her first appointment with me by her dad. Her mom had, as diplomatically as he could spell it out to me, recently up and left the family to go live some selfish New Age lifestyle with a Reiki healer. Just abandoned him with the 2 kids to raise solo, and he was doing his best for them. Therapy was the daughter's idea. She had been having troubling, intrusive thoughts lately about school shootings, like how to plan and execute one, and these thoughts were upsetting to her, and she did not want to act on them. I can still picture how scared and sad she looked telling me this. I just wanted to wrap her in my arms, but instead, I offered so much praise and encouragement for her seeking help and trusting me with this information. She also met most of the diagnostic criteria for onset of a schizoaffective disorder. We pulled Dad into a session, caught him up, explained the most urgent part of the plan. He was going to take her for a full eval with a great psychiatrist colleague of mine who understood the situation and was going to get her in stat. Daughter seemed relieved, Dad seemed relieved. We scheduled time to talk soon. Well, Mom apparently woke up from whatever festival ditch that she had passed out in to angrily call my office and flip out on me. How dare I? Am I trying to poison her child with pharmaceuticals? Did I even draw her blood and check her vitamin levels? Do I want bad Google reviews or worse yet, a warrant issued for my arrest? Do I even understand herbal supplements? I need to stop now because my head hurts remembering all of this. Next story. I had a woman one time bring in her child for scholastic issues. The child clearly had fetal alcohol syndrome, and I asked her gently if she consumed alcohol while pregnant, which she confirmed. When I told her that is likely the case of the scholastic issues, she said, "Well, I don't feel bad about it." And man, FAS in general gives me a case of the WTFs. Next story. When I was an intern in my MSW program, I had a 19-year-old client tell me that she was pregnant. Didn't know who the dad was, but had narrowed it down to 3 guys. Was not going to stop smoking meth, and had no intention of attending her OBGYN appointments. However, she was going to keep the baby to let her mom raise it, like she did with her other children. Oh my goodness. What the hell? I hate people. I'm gonna be honest with you guys. I go to my OBGYN. They don't even want me there. They say, "Sir, please leave. This is for women only," but I am trying to be progressive and inclusive. If I can go to the OBGYN, then so can this woman. Oh my God, I'm flustered. Anyway, next story. So, I had a patient in a group one time ask for advice because she was feeling pressured into sex that she really didn't want to have. A friend had traveled 2 hours to see her and gotten a hotel room for them. The group heard her out, asked questions, and the consensus was something to the effect of, "Yeah, you probably owe it to him." And I have to say, it remains one of the only times I've dropped any effort at experiential Socratic questioning and just flatly told people absolutely not. Next story. Early on in my career, while working at a community mental health center, I had a 17-year-old client that had an 18-month-old daughter and was 4.5 months pregnant when we began working together. After we built enough trust in our relationship, she disclosed that she had been repeatedly SA'd by her father for the past 3 years. He had sole custody of her because her mom suffered from drug addiction and had her parental rights terminated. She reported him to the local police, small town. However, they were friendly with her father and didn't believe her. They told her they would only follow through with her report if she would detail her SA with her father present, stating that if she could not do that, they would know she was lying. Her biggest fears were that her children were biologically her father's, and she would not get a DNA test done because she didn't want to look at them or love them differently. I made several reports to authorities that declined to investigate or remove her from the home. In the end, my supervisor and I worked our asses off to get her connected with a very thorough and helpful SA agency in another state. My agency and the new agency split the cost to get her there, settled, and safe. She was 18 years old by this time, and I still think about her 20 years later, and I hope she's okay. Next story. I had a client admit that they knowingly infected someone with HIV because they themselves were miserable and dealing with active drug addiction at the time, and they wanted someone else to be as unhappy as they were. Edit. Wow, what a response. This is and always has been a hotly debated topic in the healthcare world. For what it's worth, to clear some things up, no, I cannot call the cops just because my client does something illegal. And this is not an action that was always considered illegal or is considered illegal everywhere, by the way. It has to be something that is actively causing harm, or my client has to have active intent or a plan to cause harm. Whether or not you believe knowingly infecting someone falls within those standards is up to your personal beliefs and the laws and code of ethics of your particular state. And no, I cannot just ignore my career's code of ethics in the name of doing what I feel is right just because I find a client's actions abhorrent or based on my personal interpretation of the code. Next story. I had a preteen client whose guardian kept requesting progress notes to see how they've been doing. It's against clinic policy for clients and parents/guardians to have access to the notes. They're allowed to have access to everything else, though. The client was very defiant to everyone, but was a wonderful kid throughout their treatment with me. When I met both with the guardian and parent, who both insisted on knowing everything about the kid, everything started to make sense. Once the parent requested to switch therapists only because I declined their request to the notes, I knew how unhealthy the family dynamics were. I felt bad for the kid because they were opening up more about the family dynamics and how they impacted them. We had a good therapeutic relationship. Next story. I used to work in an acute child psych ward. Saw a lot of angry preteen/elementary kids, think 8 to 12 years old, mostly boys. And most often than not, parents treated the kids really harshly and were shocked this only made the kid worse. Also worked in an area where they did not want to hear their old school parenting could be a problem. I had one dad say to me about his 11-year-old son, "Well, yeah, I will spank him when he gets angry. Look, I know everyone nowadays doesn't like that, but I was spanked my whole life and I turned out fine." And I have to say, it took my entire ability to bite my tongue and not say to him, "Sir, you just got out of prison 3 months ago after serving 5 years for a violent felony." Next story. Not a therapist, but was a social worker. I worked with adults with developmental disabilities, ID now. A mother of one of my clients asked, "Why do I bother involving her son in activities?" Well, her son was dropped on the state's doorstep at the age of 3. Her son was 43 when he was my client. He delighted in and responded quite well to joining activities. It was another soul-crushing moment in the field. So many days of driving home crying and borderline alcoholism to numb the pain ended my almost 8 years in that field of work. Next story. We can judge. In fact, we have to judge harmful from helpful to be effective at this job. We also have to do no harm and provide the greatest beneficence to our clients. With that said, I've worked with child abusers and domestic violence perpetrators. On a number of occasions, I've worked with murderers and even a few folk involved in dogfighting. The thing that always struck me was not the sociopaths or how many former cops I saw, but how easy a few changes in your life and or brain can lead to someone being just as susceptible to pretty terrible impulses. Next story. Started my first year practicing at the county behavioral health working with foster kids. Shouted my coworker for a session with a 10-year-old. On the drive back to the office, she told me that the 10-year-old was a victim of repeated CSA and has formed a great bond with her caregivers and wants to stay with them. However, the CPS social worker was actively trying to get her back with her mom, who was still living with her boyfriend, that SA'd the client. Her therapist continued to advocate for the client to stay with the caregivers because that's what the client wanted as well. I just cannot believe that CSA isn't an immediate nope. Not getting your kids back if that person is still in contact / still lives with the perpetrator, or is the perpetrator. Next story. I evaluated a child and had to testify in family court. During the court session, I learned that the mother had rented her oldest daughter to her friends when the daughter was 15 to 17. The mother told the daughter she had to do it, otherwise her siblings would be homeless and hungry. And mother used most of the money for drugs. Father pays rents and brings groceries every week because he knows that mother didn't have money. Custody was 50-50 when this was happening. The judge did not terminate the mother's parental rights, and mother got supervised weekend visits. The judge said it wasn't clear the mother's intentions was for her friends to essay the daughter, so she wasn't going to terminate the mother's parental rights. She went on about the importance of children having a mother in their lives. Till this day, I judge both the mother and the judge. Next story. With a former therapist. Most memorable she had was a guy with serious emotional issues. His hands were all scarred up and always had fresh scabs on the knuckles when he came by. He said when he got mad, he would go to his shed and punch the soft concrete he had, or do the same to a dumpster when he was at work. In his words, he did this to avoid doing it to his girlfriend and kids, like his dad did to him. Next story. The dad told me that I had 2.5 sessions to fix his daughter. My teenage client who threatened to assault me while his father just sat there. Then there was another teenage client who got a giant tattoo of a band she had never heard of. Then an extremely abusive, like I got physically sick reading the reports of what she did to her children, mother who had her children taken by CPS, complaining about the food at the foster home not being fresh enough. Okay, so who gets a tattoo of a band they've never even heard of? Have you guys heard about the thing where people will go up to someone with a band t-shirt and they're like, name 3 songs, you faker, and you have a tattoo? Oh, that's so dumb. Anyway, next story. So, as an intern, I had a couple where the woman was chastising the man because his mother is in an abusive cult that tortures children. Mormon. The guy had excommunicated and doesn't interact with his parents and hadn't for years. She thought this is a good reason to not let him parent his children. Like, he's not allowed to go out on his own with them because his parents are Mormon. She says she's worried that he will let his mother kidnap her kids and was asking me for support for her beliefs. She was also just calling him names. It was weird. And then the whole time, the guy, he's just like, I don't even talk to my parents and I love my kids. And then in the end, she just goes, well, I guess I'm just a huge B word, aren't I? And then she looks to me as if to get my reaction. And then I accidentally blurted out, well, those are your words, not mine. Whoops. Next story. For the most part, I am able to continue having unconditional positive regard for my clients. I don't judge because they showed up, are talking about it, and want to be better for themselves. Their families, friends, partners, however, I am totally judging. Some people are just cruel and not good, but those people would never end up in my office to begin with. I think that's the difference in the privilege I have as a private practice therapist, though. I'm sure most of the stories on here will be from people who are working with populations that are mandated to go to therapy for one reason or another. Next story. So my holy crap moments really aren't out of judgment for my clients. Lots of holy crap moments come out of comparison for what people have been through. While trauma is not a competition to determine who had it the worst, I can say that the stories of refugees from war-torn or deeply unsafe countries have left a profound impact on me. But I'm not sure holy crap sums up that response. And it's not like these individuals were immune to serious trauma prior to the conflict. My country is effed up in a lot of ways, but for a lot of people, it has provided an escape from an early and violent death. Next story. I'm not a therapist, but I did volunteer for a year for a self-unaliving prevention hotline. I once had a white male client who was essentially seeking help for a sadness relating to POC/queer people. He was a white supremacist, but he wasn't seeking help to, not be a neo-Nazi anymore. He was sad and disturbed at the state of the world for not fitting his racist worldview. Dude tapped danced all around it, but said essentially, "I'm upset and sad because not everyone is straight and white." Guys, you can go online and look this up, but never ask a white supremacist the ethnicity of his girlfriend. Just don't, because it's not what you think. Anyway, next story. So I had one woman who was so desperate for male validation that she allowed her then boyfriend to install a camera in her teenage daughter's bathroom. She was the sweetest lady, you would never guess it. And she actually had a decent upbringing with positive familial relationships, just her dad worked a lot to support them and he wasn't present. Next story. Sitting in a couples session, first session ever with them, and they are openly discussing how they have 10 children between them from previous relationships and they regularly physically fight each other. Both described raging so hard that they would black out and not remember fights. Unfortunately, after they were unwilling to make a pledge that they would no longer use violence, I eventually had to end our therapeutic relationship. Next story. So, a woman that we can call Joe regularly complained of her relationship with her daughter. Her daughter had been taken from her when she was a child, approximately 8 years old, because Joe wasn't able to parent properly. Joe's driving ambition in life was to get custody of her daughter back. But everyone, including her daughter, were conspiring to prevent that from happening. Well, it turns out that Joe's daughter was 21 years old. You can't get custody of a 21-year-old, but Joe's fixation is what had driven her daughter away. Imagine stalking your own child trying to get custody of them when they're an adult. Because her daughter was 21, I didn't have to worry about any duty to warn statutes, which is good because that one would have been murky as hell. Next story. Not my client, but someone I know. A young person who orchestrated taking her own life. She was staying with family and arranged for her university to call and offer condolences to her mother for the loss of her daughter. Thing is, the daughter was just around and in the house alive. So mom hangs up the phone confused and goes upstairs to find the daughter dead by self-unaliving. She planned for the mother to find out this way. It was really twisted. Next story. I don't want to violate anyone's confidentiality, and I'm a little concerned that clients could recognize themselves in some of these stories. Careful, folks. But I will say that most of the time, when someone tells me they had a pretty good childhood actually, no real issues, but has a ton of anxiety or depression or OCD or ED behaviors, I prepare myself to hear the most horrific crap I've ever heard, and I'm rarely disappointed. The worst stories I've ever heard were prefaced by those words. So this is part of the reasons why I enjoy doing and narrating these videos, because I'm thinking to this and I'm looking back in my personal life to people I know, and it really does match up with what OP's saying there in this comment section. So I have to be, I suppose, more mindful or thoughtful of that going forward. And perhaps now I can recognize those certain things when people say, oh, I had a great childhood, but I have OCD or depression or severe anxiety or ED, eating disorder behavior. So that's really interesting. And that one, I've learned something to identify with that one, and I really enjoy that. Anyway, next story. So, an attorney who specialized in insanity defenses during the sentencing phase of death penalty cases talked about one serial killer that she worked with. She said that the most frightening person she ever met was the father of her client. Dad would tie his son's hands to the rafter in their house, then whip his son with electrical wire. Next story. So, I'm not a therapist, but I schedule first-time therapy appointments. I had this moment a few years ago when the parent of a 4-year-old child told me that they wanted to go right to medication and bypass therapy because they just didn't have the time. They also wanted to know if we would use charitable funds to pay for services in the kid's school. Typically, I would not judge a parent for this, but seeing as how the other parent's name and face were plastered everywhere around town as they were running for an unpaid political position while living in a $1 million home, I went ahead and judged the crap out of them. I'm sure you can guess the party affiliation, the one that promotes family values. Next story. Not a therapist, but a PO. I worked exclusively with sex offenders for a long time. Lots of incest and bestiality stories came out during testing. I had a client who had a sexual relationship with their twin, which was shocking. Other clients engaged in long-term sexual relationships with their mothers. I don't really think there's much hope for someone who is involved in that kind of dynamic. I don't really judge. After 20 years in the business, I've seen some version of it all by now. I just feel sad for these folks and their victims. Next story. I have worked in acute psych for the last 18 years and 25 years in the field. I have heard so much from so many people. The only real judgment I have of anyone these days is whether or not they are dangerous to be around. And if they are, I do have some strong opinions. And judgment, it's a funny thing. A person has to believe their perspective in some way is the correct/right one to have. As far as I can tell, we're all just guessing at what it means to be a human being trying to live a meaningful and fulfilling existence, created, raised, and surrounded by other human beings. Next story. I've seen and heard a lot as a therapist. However, my holy crap moments never come from what my clients say or do. It's from what their families say or do. I have had 2 clients that were victims of facetious disorder imposed on another, better known as Munchausen by proxy syndrome. Those mothers surprised me repeatedly. The lengths that they would go to keep their child sick and try to convince medical professionals that their child was sick was so extreme. The most insane part is that they fully believed the delusion despite numerous professionals stating their child was not sick. Next story. Not a therapist, but me and my mom once did family therapy with my mom's therapist, and she asked to talk to me privately and told me that my mother is one of the most difficult patients she's ever worked with, and that she herself has trouble setting boundaries with her. She said that my mom would text her long paragraphs in the middle of the night and show zero capacity for respecting others' feelings. Next story. This is quite disturbing, so please don't read on if you are easily triggered. I have a client in their 80s who was placed in an industrial school run by Christian brothers. One of his core childhood memories is a stray dog coming onto the grounds who the boys looked after for a week, sneaking at the little food they had for the comfort of a dog's unrelenting love. When one of the sadistic brothers found out, he hunt the dog in the courtyard in front of all the boys. He made the boys watch for an hour as he kept letting go of his makeshift noose. My client told me he will never forget the sound of all the boys crying as they were forced to watch this bastard. This brother continued to smoke cigarette after cigarette, which the smell still lingers to my client this day. Man, F organized religion. If this image has been burned into my brain from description, I can't even fathom how those boys felt living that kind of horror. Next story. I'm not a therapist, but I worked as an RA, essentially a psych tech, at a mental health treatment center for about a year before moving on to a different area of healthcare. We had a sex addiction program, and many of the clients' past actions/behaviors were pretty hard to stomach. One man cheated on their wife with his ostensible best friend's teenage daughter, while he himself had teenage children. Another frequently brought escorts into his home while his children were there. One man had sex with animals. Another had been caught with CP. It's not so much that I judged them per se, but many of these stories engender sort of an existential dread, as in, wow, the darkness of the human condition runs deep. This could have happened to me or someone I know. It could be difficult to cope with. Many of clients were also extremely unpleasant to be around in terms of their personality. Domineering sorts, obsessiveness, terrible boundaries, no emotion, inappropriate emotion, manipulation, anger, irritability, compulsiveness, you name it. Takes a lot of understanding and compassion to support them through it all. Not always easy, but many of them had extremely traumatic pasts that made empathy easier to find. Commonly, they had experienced horrific SA themselves. In one case, a client was repeatedly SA'd by his brother throughout childhood while his parents knew all about it and did nothing. His mother even walked in the room during an assault and simply turned around and left. These are the types of things that the clients deal with. I think people who make a career in mental health are effing heroes, but I could not do it long term. It's a tragic reflection of our society that most people working in it do it for pennies. Next story. I'm not a therapist, but worked at a primary school, and we were all responsible for safeguarding. I worked in first aid and saw a lot of kids. One day I had this girl, she was 8, complaining about a tummy ache. I sat her with me and got her some water to monitor her. I asked her how long it had been hurting and if anything else felt poorly. She said it hurts when she pees and she has some blood in her knickers, and I instantly thought very young, starter, rare, but not unheard of. I asked if it's happened before and she said yes, and it always happens after her brother plays with her. Instant alarm bells. I get the safeguarding lead and report my concerns. Turns out the brother repeatedly SA'd her and she was so small and he was not gentle, so she bled every time. Her mother knew and encouraged it. Next story. Even though I'm a therapist, I'm still human and have my own human reactions. How I handle them in therapy is important, though. I have worked with quite a few people who have done objectively awful things without an ounce of remorse. In those cases, it is on me to be a bit more confrontational, not judgmental necessarily, but trying to push past their justifications of self-victimizing so they may be able to appreciate the harm that they have caused. Next story. So there's enough horror in here already. So this is more of an, what kind of situation? I was sitting in on a psycho ed eval during the later years of my training. Client was a high school age male who was known to the practice already. Before getting rolling, the client asks for a tissue. Sure, normal stuff. Between spring allergies and all of the standard reasons you would need tissues in the course of therapy, we were plenty stoked. Trying to build some rapport as the outsider in the room, I did the "how's the weather" equivalent here, and I said, "Oh, bad allergies? Nah, I just need a parachute." Kiddo lays out the tissue on a side table, takes out his XR vision of his prescribed ADHD medication, and proceeds to pop open the capsule, empty the medication onto the center of the tissue, wrap it up like a tiny old-timey bindle bag, and swallows it. My highly seasoned supervisor doesn't bat an eyelash, but I'm clearly perplexed. So the client explains to me that when he doesn't want to deal with the extended releases part of his meds, he simply removes the extension mechanism, the capsule shell, and swallows the med in a tissue parachute, which apparently was pretty standard amongst his peers. I had never heard of it before, have never seen it referenced since, but it stood out over the copious bizarre stories about illicit drug use I heard working with juvenile court for assessments because it was so normal seeming. So, has anybody else ever heard of this parachuting method? I've never seen it referenced or talked about in any regard, so this is a new one for me, but feel free to comment if you guys know about this, and I do check the comments. I'm always there. Anyway, next story. So, my ex was a therapist, and she told me about a patient who kept sleeping with a guy who'd tell her to get the F out the next morning. She was in love with him, but he was openly just using her for sex. Like, he told her that to her face. This situation happened for over a year. The patient refused to address the situation with him, and despite claiming to never speak to him again, she'd go out of her way to bump into him and sleep with him around 2 to 3 times a month. My ex said she did some research on if she could put a restraining order between the two of them. Next story. I am an addictions therapist, so I've seen people from all walks of life in all sorts of conditions. Find it hard to judge anyone for anything as a result, but I do judge when I've got a doctor, lawyer, wealthy individual in my chair acting like their addiction is somehow less damaging because of their income, profession, or social status, that their bad behavior somehow gets a pass. Respectably? No. Next story. Trigger warning, animal abuse. I'm not a therapist, but a nurse at a mental health facility. For a time, we were taking patients as young as 6 years old. We had this one girl who was 7. She apparently came from a very neglectful, probably abusive situation. She was adopted by a very nice family at the age of 3. She was absolutely adorable. But her parents brought her in because they found out she had been killing neighbors' pets. She had brought home a kitten that she had killed, poked its eyes out, and stuffed candy in the empty sockets. After several psychiatrists consulted on the case, the consensus was that she should be placed in an institution for life. Just heartbroken on so many levels. No idea what happened after because we were not a long-term facility. Next story. I was a therapist pretty briefly and moved on to another profession, but I'll never forget one client in particular during my internship. You see, my internship was at a site that primarily did court-mandated therapy sessions for people who were going through the criminal justice system. The client was in the system because he had SA'd his girlfriend's 12-year-old daughter, while the mother was in the bed as they slept one night. Now, as a therapist, they drive it into you pretty hard during your training that we're all basically good as human beings, and I believe that with very few exceptions, but this man was one of those exceptions. He felt no remorse or guilt for what he had done, and what's worse is he tried to justify his actions. It was clear in speaking with him that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened, not just with this child, but with others. Sitting with him for an hour at a time was difficult, and he stopped coming after only a few sessions. And the email that I sent his parole officer stating that he had missed his court-mandated sessions was the only one I sent gladly in my time there. I'm sure this man had a terrible childhood himself, and perhaps over several years could get to a better place. But in my view, the only place for him was in a jail cell for the time being. Next story. For me, it was more of a series of moments. I can't help but feel some kind of way when a parent brings me their teenager who is wanting to take their own life, or is depressed and clearly does not care, and the kids know that they don't care. I can have intellectual empathy that something happened to the parent for them to behave that way, but I really struggle when parents bring their teens to me with the intention of fixing the kid rather than providing support and guidance for the family. It crushes my soul when I see a teen who is so used to being cast aside that they don't bat an eye when their parents throw a fit because the teen needs to be assessed for safety, and it was an inconvenience to the parent. And it's really hard to withhold judgment in those situations. Then another holy crap moment is when one of my clients openly admitted to being racist, homophobic, transphobic, sexist, etc. And he felt good about the fact that he could claim those labels. That was only one of the reasons I had to transfer him, but it sent a chill down my spine when he looked me in the eye, knowing that I am a queer therapist, and proceeded to tell me all of the ways in which he hated my community. So yeah, there have definitely been some interesting moments. Next story. So I had a dad call and yell at me for 20 minutes one time because I had told his son that he had to take responsibility for himself and his actions. His son was 16. Then another, I had a middle school kid come in with what I thought to be his grandfather actually be his dad. His dad said the mom had run off and wasn't in the picture. Fast forward 3 months later, a very young Eastern European woman comes in wanting to talk to me about her son. When I started to put the pieces together, something seemed off. She was a mail-order bride and admitted to it. The son then confirmed to me, "Yeah, I know my dad ordered her." Yeah, wild times. Next story. I was the patient in this scenario, but at one point when I had been seeing my therapist for several months, she wanted to examine why being around my mother was so stressful for me. I recounted to her the story of telling my mom her son had abused me throughout most of my childhood, and that I wouldn't be visiting for Christmas anymore because there was no longer a way for me to sleep behind a locked door. My mother proceeded to scream at me and call me names while I sobbed so hard I ended up puking, and then emptied all of my bank accounts because I no longer deserved to go to college, and she eventually put the money back about a week later and called me to tell me I had missed the very expensive present that she bought me. This was a lie. She hadn't bought anything. She still pretends this never happened and cries to everyone that I never talked to her. My therapist's response to all of this was, "Jesus Christ, what the F?" followed by a moment of silence while she tried to process that. So this reminds me of a friend of mine who told me that her therapist, after explaining about her relationship with her dad, her therapist said, okay, I need to stop. Your dad is an a-hole," and then went back to therapist mode, which I don't know if that's professional, but knowing my friend in the stories of her dad, he does kind of suck. But anyway, next story. So, not a therapist, but years ago, I went to therapy with my then wife, now ex. She picked the therapist who was a woman, so I kind of thought anything I say is going to be met with skepticism. I know it's dumb thinking that, but that's what I thought at the time. In one of the sessions, I told the therapist about an incident that happened, which I will try to keep brief here. So I was off from work and cleaning the house. I had just finished in the kitchen and was doing laundry. There were 5 kids and 2 adults living in the house. I had 4 stepchildren, and my daughter was maybe a year old at the time. Anyway, there's laundry in the washer and dryer, and I had just finished folding laundry, so I was taking a break watching TV until the dryer was done. It was around noontime, and my wife comes home from work on her lunch break. I say hi to her as she walks into the living room, looks around and says, "Why haven't you dusted?" And I was shocked, and she got mad because I was just sitting on the couch, and I was annoyed and said, "Fine, I'll start dusting." And we had a glass-top coffee table, so I got some Windex and paper towels and started cleaning. And she says, "No, forget it, don't." And we argue back and forth with me basically saying, yelling, that I'll finish cleaning up. As I'm wiping the Windex off the table, I see this thick brown liquid streaming down on top of the table. It's pancake syrup that my wife is pouring out because she really doesn't want me to clean now. And I look at her and I say, "Are you effing crazy?" And she rips the Windex bottle from my hands and sprays me in the eyes. After a few seconds, I feel my eyes burn and I get up and run past my wife to go outside to the hose and rinse my face off. And I look at the therapist and she doesn't look like she believes anything I just said, and looks over at my wife and says, "Okay, what's your version of what happened?" And surprisingly, my wife says, "Well, everything he said happened, but I didn't spray him in the eyes. He's lying. I sprayed him on the neck." The therapist is now shocked and looks at my wife and says, "So that whole story is true?" And my wife says, "Yeah, but I didn't spray him in the face. He's lying." The therapist then asks my wife why she thought I ran outside to the house, and my wife says she didn't know why. They go back and forth about the story, and the therapist just seems surprised by the whole thing. My wife then says, "Yeah, he's lying because I didn't spray him in the face. I sprayed him on the cheek." And I'm now shocked because she just changed her story, and I pointed out to the therapist, who also mentions to my wife that she changed her story. My wife is getting pissed and is adamant that she didn't change her story. The therapist also points out that the cheek is on the face. My wife then gets really pissed off and stands up and yells at me and the therapist and storms out. I looked over at the therapist and she's sitting there speechless. And one would think this would be the end or close to the end of the marriage, but I hung on like an idiot for probably another 10 years before finally filing for divorce. Next story. Not a therapist, but used to be a support worker for survivors of abuse, adults, and children. I've had a couple. The sheer number of women who don't realize that someone having sex with you while you're sleeping is SA. The woman whose ex SA'd her so severely, so often she had a vaginal prolapse and blocked back passage, which needed surgery. He continued to SA her during recovery. There was the woman who didn't know you don't need your husband's permission to go out with your friends. And then, as for the children, the 14-year-old boy who had been physically and psychologically abused by his sister's dad when he was 5 years old. His twin brother and his sister weren't abused, only him, to the point that this effer held this child face down in the bathtub. My heart shattered for this boy. Then there was the 9-year-old boy who told me about his demon side that tells him nasty things like how useless and pointless he is, how he has had thoughts of self-unaliving at 9 years old, and doesn't feel like he can tell anyone because boys don't cry, and crying makes you weak, he said to me. Then there's the 13-year-old girl whose father bought and made her wear sexy lingerie when she was 9 years old, while he self-pleasured and didn't even stop when his 8-year-old son entered the room. The mother ran for the effing hills with the kids after that and had to learn English. Her husband had never allowed her to learn despite having lived in the country for years, and one of the first words she had to learn was self-pleasure. Just gross. So I never judged my clients. I love working with those people, but they're abusers. Don't spend nearly enough time on fire. Next story. Late to the party here, but I am the boss of therapists, so many people don't realize how hollow a lot of therapists can become, especially the newer ones. They give all of their efforts to their clients, and then they have nothing left for themselves. So many deal with depression and anxiety. One story in particular is I had a therapist who I had a good rapport with tell me, "I'll most likely end my life in 3 to 4 years," so matter-of-factly, without emotion. She has had lifelong depression and other physical and mental health issues, and essentially was resigned to the fact that they would only get worse. That one really stuck with me. Next story. Not a therapist, but while on call to vent about US politics with mine, lives in UK, I was freaking out about how much political activist stuff revolves around how to avoid getting arrested. Like, I understand that there is a major jump between going to town halls and starting a Tesla on fire, but so many protest guides don't talk about sunscreen and water anymore. They talk about facial recognition and rubber bullets and an all manner of things. So when I said the stuff I was seeing was how to not get arrested, she verbally said, "Jesus Christ." Next story. As someone who works in an alternative school with probably 80% of my clients having experienced significant trauma, I could only read a small portion of this thread. I hold a hell of a lot of heavy crap for my clients. I can only deal with so much more. But my issues are with CPS. I have seen kiddos left in horrible circumstances, a couple of cans of food in the house for the family for a whole week, violence perpetrated against the kiddos with witnesses and physical evidence, homes I would not let my dog live in, predators living in the home, drug paraphernalia in the home, plus lots of evidence of dealing or making of meth, parents who knew how to present sane to the caseworkers who believed them despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, cases allowed to go on for years despite the impact on the children, because the parents could pull it together long enough to get custody for a couple of months, but could not hold it together long-term, etc. And legally, I have to make the calls, but it is such a waste of time and often negatively impacts the therapeutic relationship with the kiddos who thought they finally could talk openly with someone who listens, who they could trust, but not anymore. Sorry for the run-ons, it's been a rough couple of weeks for me. I need a vacation, but my kiddos, they don't get one. Next story. Not a therapist, but worked with people with developmental disabilities. I got to supervise a visit between my disabled client one time and her brother who had pimped her out because she wanted to see him. There were no charges, so we just had to keep her safe. Then someone I was job coaching, not developmentally disabled to my knowledge, casually shared that she caught her daughter sleeping around once and beat her between the legs with a belt. Since it was an old story and then the child was an adult, I was told not to report it. Next story. Not a therapist as well, but I was a social service specialist. I was interviewing someone who had applied for SNAP benefits. She started telling me about how her husband had SA'd her son, 18, from age 2 until 18, and probably did the same to her daughter, 20. Then, an hour later, she casually mentions that her husband cheated on her, and if he hadn't, he wouldn't be in jail. She did not explicitly say it, but I very much got the impression that she only reported the SA of her son because her husband stepped out of the marriage. Next story. The things that truly shock me are the kinds of things that have to do with how dark humanity can get, the type of experiences my clients have had at the hands of abusers. However, I would prefer to share this instead. I used to work with teenagers, and one of them brought a backpack to a session. Completely normal until the backpack began to wiggle. He literally had a puppy inside of his backpack. Of course, we opened it and kept the puppy out and about for the rest of the session, but essentially his game plan was, my mom told me I can't get a dog, so I'm going to sneak this dog into the house, and then I will already have a dog, and there's nothing she can do. Then, on a similar note, I used to work in a residential treatment center with teenagers, and the kitchen staff noticed that all of the clients staying in one wing of the facility seemed to be stuffing lettuce in their pockets at lunchtime. You guessed it, there was a guinea pig living under one of their beds. I'm still bummed that they didn't get to keep it. Next story. It wasn't necessarily that it was that bad, but completely caught me off guard. I was in a role where I did groups with people who worked together, and I also saw them individually. They all knew through each other in the program that they were a part of. After working with them for almost a year and heading into my final sessions with them, one of them told me that their married coworker, who was also my client, had confessed that they were in love with them, wanted to leave their spouse, and wanted me to do a joint session with them. My eyes went wide because it was so unexpected. The married client had never given me any indication of those feelings, and I knew I was terminating with them both shortly. I did not do the joint session with them, and I learned then to have a much better poker face. Next story. Not a therapist, but a patient, but when I was like 14 years old, I was super edgy and was deep into my creepypasta and in love with serial killers phase, like most 12 to 14-year-old girls who don't really know how to process bad thoughts. And I told my therapist I wish I had the emotional strength of Bum from Killing Stalking, and I watched her look up what it was and in real time realized that I needed severe inpatient treatment for a while. Next story. One of my now adult clients told me about the child fight clubs that their dad would run. Whoever won got to eat that night. Edit. There was also a time when I worked in a mental hospital overnight intake, and a very old man described in detail how he SA'd his baby granddaughter. First time I had to call CPS was that night. Next story. So I started doing therapy with this grandmother and her 5-year-old grandson who she had custody of. She was concerned that he was waking up several times at night screaming, and he kept putting PB&J sandwiches in the VCR and destroying them. Found out she was his great-great-grandmother at 60 years old. When I suggested she put the VCR in her room so he couldn't have access to it, she said it was his VCR in his room. She had replaced it 3 times in the past 6 months. When I asked her what kind of shows he watched on the VCR, she said, Jason, Michael Myers, and Freddy Krueger. No crap, the kid is waking up at night scared and couldn't sleep. Then worked with another grandmother who complained that her granddaughter, 13 years old, was dressing too grown and inappropriate, and she didn't like it. When I asked the girl what she thought about what her grandmother said, her response was, well, if she doesn't like the clothes I wear, why does she keep buying them for me? I didn't even ask for them. She just keeps bringing stuff home for me when she goes shopping. Next story. Brother-in-law developed a drinking problem after working with at-risk youth. He was favored by so many of the kids, so he made crazy bonds with these kids. One in particular was an 11-year-old girl who had been SA'd by her grandparents and older brother since she was 6. She was trying to transition at 11 into a boy, and she told him it's because if she was a boy, that would have never happened to her, and her family would have never done that to her. He is still kicking the habit and doesn't want kids. He is so traumatized. He quit. Next story. So I worked for an organization that housed children that were under the care of child safety. I wasn't in a clinical role, but because I'm qualified, I was always asked about everything and anything. So there was a time that my colleague asked me to come in and read the daily update email from a support worker. And halfway down the email, one of the workers said they gave the child a back massage. This particular child had been SA'd by their stepmother during massages, and that was one of the reasons she was in the system and was under the organization's care. I had to read the email twice because I couldn't believe it. I was horrified. The client had one of the most horrible backgrounds that I have come across. The first words that came out of my mouth were, "What the F? Fire the support worker ASAP." Next story. I feel like this should be categorized into things clients told you that are realistic versus delusions or symptoms of mental illness. I had a geriatric client tell me that he worked in Nazi death camps and enjoyed the suffering. The dude was straight up evil to the nursing staff and seemed to enjoy watching them get hurt. A gal smacked her head on a Hoyer lift, broke her nose in the process, and he cackled. Then, on the other hand, I had a guy in a schizophrenic episode who told me he flew the plane into the second tower because Ben and Jerry's discontinued his favorite ice cream flavor. He also believed he was Hunter Biden and accredited his survival to his father's connections with the mob. Both were memorable, but I still have stress dreams about the first dude. Well, folks, this was dark and depressing and sad at times, wasn't it? Perhaps I've become numb after reading so many of these. I've only cried once from reading a story. I don't remember what it was, but man, that ruined me. I wish I could remember what it was, though. But anyway, guys, I always try to end things on a positive note. So thanks for watching, commenting, have a really good day, and bye-bye!